So Jesus was back, and had been for a little while now. They'd all seen him, first Mary in the garden, some disciples on the road to Emmaus, and then the main crew, locked up in a room away from the general public. They got not one, but 2 visits from the resurrected Jesus, with all of his scars to prove it. Thomas insisted on reaching out and touching those scars, so they knew that Jesus was indeed back. But the disciples were still figuring out what they were meant to do with this new turn of events. It seems like every time I try to imagine myself as a disciple in any of their predicaments, I always end up asking the same question: what do I do now? Just when the shock of Jesus' death has started to subside, he shows up again. How on earth is one supposed to respond to this? I've lost people close to me, a number of them, and none of them have ever come back from their deaths. So I can relate to a number of the disciples on a number of occasions, but this situation is not one of them. I can only imagine their confusion. The rush of emotions, the questions, the rationalization. They knew how to follow Jesus before he died. They just did whatever he said. But since being back, he made only short appearances and then was suddenly gone again. Was it ever going to be the same? It seems like waiting around in that stuffy attic got to a number of them, because they went and did what I hear a lot of men do when life just gets to be too much to handle. They went fishing. There is something incredibly comforting about returning to what you know. It had been a while since any of these former fishermen had actually done any fishing. It must have been a very welcome distraction. And while I want this choice to be about self-care, the boys taking to their boats with a couple of beers and being alone with their thoughts, or maybe just taking a chance to have a deep conversation and detangle their collective confusion, but I don't actually think that this was a self-care choice. Peter, his brother Andrew, and a number of the other disciples were never in those boats for leisure. They were professional fishermen. This was their vocation before they knew Jesus. This was the life, the identity that Jesus had beckoned them from. Not because there's anything wrong with the life or status of a typical fisherman, but because he saw something in these particular men. These guys who didn't have the status or education to make their way into society's higher places, who had just enough money to keep themselves going day to day. These hard-working fellows who were completely underestimated and looked down on by the empire. These were people that Jesus could build a kingdom with. Jesus had called out to these particular fishermen. He had called them away from their vocation and into discipleship, to an education, to learn a completely new way of life, and to teach it to other people. To spread good news that would undo the harmful systems of oppression, that would have us all believe that a select, powerful, rich few are somehow more worthy of respect and love than the other 99%. Jesus had called these guys away from their boats to work toward a better world. There was a plan. And through their discipleship, they learned how to do it, what to say. Jesus had shown them. But the whole thing went sideways when Jesus was arrested and then executed in public. It got incredibly dramatic. Despite his resurrection, Jesus had still died, and the whole thing was rather a lot. I totally get their resistance to all the drama. I get the lure of going back to what was familiar and easy, especially during what must have felt like a disruption in the momentum of their discipleship. But knowing his disciples, Jesus knew exactly where to find them. He's right there on the shore, watching them trying to back paddle through time to their old lives. And doesn't Jesus see a funny and sorry sight? A bunch of professional fishermen unable to catch a single thing. I wonder how long he watched, waiting for them to realize that that ship, so to speak, had sailed. It wasn't who they were anymore. They were no longer fishermen because Jesus had made them fishers of men. Eventually, he can't watch anymore and he calls out to them, "Hey boys, nothing biting? Try the other side of the boat." Now remember, at this point, they don't realize it's Jesus calling out to them from the shore. He just comes off as a backseat driver telling them how to do their jobs from afar. But after failing miserably, it couldn't hurt to listen to the guy. So they do it, and lo and behold, not only do they start catching fish, they catch so many, they can't hoist the net back into the boat. It's just bursting. And it's so amazing that John, in particular, gets suspicious about this man shouting advice from the shore. I can actually imagine him squinting as he tries to work it out. It's him. Jesus had appeared again. More than just a mysterious enigma this time, appearing and disappearing in a dusty, locked room. He was real, and he was out here on the beach, just like the first time some of them had ever seen him. Peter is so excited by it that he dives into the water and swims back to the harbor. The rest of them steer the boat in, hauling this massive catch, and are met by Jesus, who has a fire roaring and ready to grill up a fish breakfast. Brunch on the beach. He's not just here to give them fishing tips. It's time to talk about the way forward. And no big discussion or imparting of wisdom can be done on an empty stomach. So the fish gets grilled, and it gets passed around with some bread. This is a familiar meal for these guys. I imagine the familiarity of eating this particular meal was comforting and would help calm some of their confusion and panic. This was Jesus' third appearance to them collectively, and they were finally going to get some clarity. After breakfast, Jesus has a talk with Peter, and you'd think that Peter has some explaining to do, but Jesus is the one doing most of the talking. I have to wonder how Peter felt knowing that Jesus was back after his whole denial debacle. He spends a lot of time throughout the Gospels speaking without thinking, just constantly shooting his mouth off with over-the-top declarations of devotion that don't quite sit with reality. He has great intentions, but at the Last Supper, Jesus has to put him in his place. After swearing up and down that he would follow Jesus anywhere and that he could undergo anything that Jesus could in order to stick by him, Jesus has to tell Peter flat out he wasn't up to the task. He did say that Peter would be ready one day, just not yet. And then he tells Peter quite bluntly that he would deny ever knowing Jesus. I can only imagine how misunderstood and gutted Peter must have felt hearing that. But when the evening led to Jesus getting arrested, Peter, finding himself surrounded by questioning strangers, did exactly what Jesus said he would do. 3 times. 3 times Peter had a chance to declare his discipleship and Jesus' lordship. And each time he decided it was too much trouble. He denied knowing Jesus, being near Jesus, being one of his followers. The only thing worse than feeling like someone doesn't understand you is when it turns out they are completely right, and it is you who doesn't understand yourself. So as someone who likes closure and clearing the air for the sake of moving forward, I really appreciate this discussion. This conversation that Jesus has with Peter after all of that. I notice a few things about this conversation that I think are worth mentioning. The first is that Jesus seems to be asking the same question multiple times. But for me, it's the number of times that stands out. It's 3. 3 times Jesus asks Peter if he loves him. It feels like Jesus is giving him 3 opportunities to declare his discipleship and undo each of his denials. It's not a magic spell, but sometimes these actions can make a difference in our hearts and our minds. And I'm sure that Peter's actions had deeply affected both his heart and his mind. Anything he could do to lift the weight of regret, I'm sure, was very welcome. And I think this conversation is worth paying attention to because even though it's between Jesus and Peter, it applies to each of the disciples. In fact, it applies to all of us. When wondering where to take our discipleship, how to act out our belief and devotion to God, this is a passage that we can turn to for very explicit instruction. Each time, Jesus receives Peter's answer to the question, "Do you love me?" He gives an instruction, and it couldn't be any plainer. Feed my lambs. Tend my sheep. Feed my sheep. What I hear Jesus saying is take care of each other. Look for the people in this world who need to know life-changing love. Guide them in this way of love. Strengthen them. Show them how to then go on and share this love with others. Christ's kingdom is not built on miracles and public declarations. It is built on love. Love that says that we are more than our incomes or occupations, or even just the things that we are good at. Love says we are more than our pedigree or family legacies. The kingdom is built on a love that is patient enough to give second and third and fourth chances to get it right. System-shattering love that challenges us from running back to the safety of old habits because we have what we need to move forward bravely into the world and change what needs changing. We have enough. Love says we are enough. So when life feels confusing, remember Jesus' words, "Tend to my sheep." When you are not sure what God's will for your life is, or if you're not sure that you have anything of value to give to the world, remember your job, your gift is to love. This is how Jesus made disciples. And this is how he instructed his disciples to make more disciples. This is how we have been discipled and how we must disciple others. It's that simple and that challenging. Feed the sheep. Let's take care of one another and never stop loving. Tend the sheep. Amen.